Nobody ever said my name. That was the first thing I noticed. Not immediately. Not in the clean, cinematic way people notice things in stories. There was no sudden silence in a crowded room. No dramatic realization sliding into place like a knife entering soft flesh. It happened slowly, quietly, like mold growing behind wallpaper. At first it felt insignificant. A coincidence repeated too many times. Then a pattern. Then something heavier. Something that began sitting inside my chest during conversations, pressing harder each day until I couldn't hear people speaking without listening for it. Or rather, listening for the absence of it. Can you approve this? Do we move forward? What do you think? Questions everywhere. Eyes on me constantly. But never my name. Not once. The first real moment it unsettled me was in the conference room on the 9th floor. Tuesday morning. Rain smearing itself down the windows in long gray streaks that made the entire city outside look unfinished. The air conditioner hummed above us with a low mechanical vibration that made the fluorescent lights tremble almost imperceptibly. I remember staring at those lights while Martin talked. Not because I cared about the light, because I couldn't look at him. Martin had a way of speaking that felt rehearsed even when it wasn't. Like every sentence had already been tested privately in front of a mirror. He stood at the far end of the table with one hand in his pocket, the other resting against a stack of printed reports. Everyone else watched him. I watched the condensation sliding down my water glass. "We can still pull out," he said. Silent. Then his eyes moved to me. Not directly at first. Toward me. Around me. Past me. Like he was carefully avoiding a specific point in space. "But if we do that," he continued carefully, "we lose leverage." Nobody spoke. The room felt too cold. I became aware of my own breathing. Slow. Controlled. Too controlled. The kind of breathing you do when you become conscious of breathing, and suddenly every inhale feels artificial. Martin waited. The others wait. Janice tapping her fingernail against a pen. Elliot staring down at his laptop without typing. Renee leaning back with crossed arms, watching me from the corner of her eye, the way people watch a dog they aren't sure is friendly. Waiting for me. I cleared my throat. Even that sounded wrong. Too loud in the room. "I think," I said slowly, "if we pull out now, they'll interpret hesitation as weakness." Martin nodded immediately. "Too quickly." "Exactly," a few others nodded too. Tiny movement. Instant agreement. Like my words had merely confirmed something already decided. Then Martin said, "Then we proceed." That should have been normal, it wasn't. Because he didn't say. "Then we proceed with Daniel's recommendation." He didn't say. "Then we proceed because he thinks it's best." Nothing attached to me. Nothing linking the decision to an actual person. And somehow that bothered me more than criticism would have. I didn't realize how deeply it bothered me until later that evening, when I was alone in my apartment, reheating leftover soup I wasn't hungry for. The microwave rotated slowly. The bowl clinked every few seconds against the glass plate. Clang, pausing, clang. I stood there staring through the dark microwave door at my own reflection, warped by the rotating bowl. And suddenly I heard the conversation again. Not the word, the shape of it, the space around it. I opened the microwave before it finished. Steam rolled upward into my face. I remember holding the bowl without moving. Hot ceramic burning my fingertip. Thinking, why didn't he say my name? The thought felt ridiculous immediately afterward. Paranoid. Childish. I actually laughed once under my breath. Short. Dry. But the laugh didn't remove the feeling. Because underneath it was another thought. A quieter one. When was the last time anyone there said my name? I stood motionless in the kitchen trying to remember. And the terrifying thing, I couldn't. Not clearly. Not recently. Not with certainty. I put the soup down untouched. The apartment felt strange that night. Not unfamiliar. Worse. Overly familiar. Like every object had been sitting in the exact same position for too long. The lamp beside the couch casting that same amber pool of light. The crack in the ceiling above the hallway. The faint smell of old coffee trapped somewhere in the kitchen walls. Everything looked staged. Deliberate. I walked to the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror. People say that in stories all the time. Stared at myself in the mirror. Usually it means something dramatic. This wasn't dramatic. It was clinical. I looked tired. 35 but older around the eyes. My face seemed oddly flat under the bathroom light, like features assembled correctly but without identity attached. I touched the sink with both hands. Cold porcelain. And I said my own name out loud, quietly, just to hear it. Daniel, my voice sounded unfamiliar immediately afterward, like hearing a recording of yourself unexpectedly. I frowned, waited. Nothing happened. Of course nothing happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had interrupted something. Like the apartment had been listening. I slept badly, not because of nightmares, because I kept surfacing from shallow sleep with the sensation that I'd forgotten something essential. At 3:12 a.m., I woke staring at the ceiling, my heart already racing, no dream, no memory. Just panic already fully formed before consciousness arrived. The darkness in the room looked dense, heavy. Streetlight leaked through the blinds in thin, pale bars across the wall. I listened. Apartment sounds, pipes, distant traffic. A neighbor moving somewhere overhead. Then a voice. Not inside the apartment. In the hallway outside. Muffled. A man speaking softly. I froze. The floorboards above creaked again. Then silent. I waited, my pulse beating hard enough to feel inside my throat. The voice came again. Closer this time. Not close enough to understand words. Only cadence. Conversation. Another voice answered. Then footsteps moved away. I exhaled slowly without realizing I'd been holding my breath. But I didn't sleep again after that. I lay there staring into darkness thinking about names. How often people use them. How naturally. How unconsciously. A waiter saying your name after reading your card. A doctor saying it before giving result. Friends saying it across crowded rooms. Names anchor things. Without them people drift. By morning my exhaustion had sharpened into irritation. At myself. At the thought itself. I almost convinced myself to forget it entirely during the elevator ride to work. Almost. Then the doors opened onto the executive floor. And the receptionist smiled at me. Not warmly. Professionally. Good morning's no name. I felt it immediately. Tiny movement inside my stomach. I nodded once and kept walking. The office smelled faintly of printer toner and stale carpet cleaner. The same smell every morning. Usually invisible to me. Now overwhelming. I became aware of everything. Keyboard click. Phones vibrating against desk. Shoes against carpet. Conversations lowering slightly when I passed. Not stopping. Just lowering. I told myself I was imagining it, which only made me more aware. By noon I had begun tracking it unconsciously. People speaking around me, to me, near me. Never my name. Not one. Even email. I checked. Scrolled through weeks of messages. Strained. Not impossible, but strange. Can you review this? Need your decision. Waiting on confirmation. No Daniel. Not even signatures addressing me directly. My chest tightened slowly as I read. I tried to rationalize it. Corporate culture. Efficiency. Minimalism. But rational explanations began feeling thin. Like paper soaked in water at 2:17 p.m. Martin appeared beside my office door. He didn't knock. Just stood there with one hand resting against the frame. We need to discuss the Keller situation. I looked up from my screen. Something in me had already become hyper-alert around him. Not fear exactly. Observation. Like watching someone perform sleight of hand after learning they're capable of theft. Keller rejected the revisions. Martin stepped inside slowly. Closed the door halfway. Not fully. Halfway felt worse. He rejected the language changes, he said. Then he paused, watching me carefully. Not my eyes. My reaction. There's concern about exposure. Interesting word. I leaned back slightly, and Martin tilted his head. Tiny movement. Almost sympathetic. We need a final direction, again. Nide from me. But dotat. Like instructions arriving from nowhere. The office suddenly felt too small. I noticed the hum of my computer fan. The faint ache in my neck. The dryness in my mouth. Martin waited patiently. Too patiently. I realized he knew I was uncomfortable. Not why, but that I was. And he was studying it. Testing pressure. The realization made something colder appear underneath my anxiety. Suspicion. I said carefully. What exactly are you asking me? His expression didn't change, but the silence stretched half a second too long. Then, you know what I'm asking, there it was. Pressure. Not direct. Worse. Implied. My fingers curled slightly against the armrest. I suddenly became aware that I could hear people talking faintly outside the office through the partially open door. Muffled voices. Distant laughter. Life continuing normally while something invisible tightened around my throat. Martin stepped closer. Not aggressively. Quietly. Controlled. If this escalates, he said softly, we all become vulnerable. We all. Interesting again. But not true. Not equally. I could feel it, the imbalance. Like standing on a floor beginning to tilt. And what decision has already been made? I asked. A flicker crossed his face. Gone immediate. There are recommendations, no ownership, no source. The room suddenly felt airless. I stood up too quickly. My chair rolled backwards slightly. Martin didn't move, didn't react. That unnerved me more than if he had. I walked to the window. Rain again. The city below looked blurred and distant behind gray glass. Why does nobody say my name anymore? The question escaped before I could stop it. Silence behind me. Heavy silence. Not confused. Measured. I turned slowly. Martin was watching me carefully now. Really watching me. And for the first time since entering the office, he looked uncertain. Not surprised. Uncertain. As if deciding something. Then, you should go home. Every muscle in my body tightened instantly. Not because of the words, because he still didn't say my name. I stared at him, waiting for correction, for explanation, for normal human response. Instead, he lowered his voice further. You're exhausted. The room tilted slightly. Not physically, psychologically. Something slipping out of alignment. I realized suddenly he was speaking to me the way people speak to someone unstable. Carefully, without provoking. And the horrifying part was how subtle it was. Enough deniability to make me question myself. I laughed once, sharply, humorless. Do you hear yourself? Martin remained calm. Too calm. You've been under pressure. There it is again. What? That. I stepped toward him. You keep talking around me. His eyes narrowed slightly. Not anger. Calculation. Then finally, he said it. Daniel, the sound hit me harder than it should have. Like a physical impact inside my chest. Relief flooded through me so suddenly, it was almost euphoric. Which terrified me immediately afterward. Because no name should matter that much. No single word should feel like oxygen returning to a sealed room. Martin saw the reaction. I know he did. And that was the moment something changed. Tiny. Invisible. But permanent. Because his expression shifted. Just slightly. Like someone confirming a suspicion. Then he nodded once. Slowly. There you are. I felt cold instantly. Not emotionally. Physically. A wave of cold spreading beneath my skin. What does that mean? But Martin was already stepping backward toward the door. We'll continue this later. Then he left. And the door remained half open behind him. I stood motionless in the office listening to the distant office noise outside. Keyboard, phones, murmurs, everything normal. Everything horribly normal. My reflection floated faintly in the darkened window. For a moment, just a moment, I had the unmistakable sensation that I was watching someone else stand there in my office wearing my body. And the worst part was he looked more composed than I felt. I didn't leave immediately. I should have. Instead, I sat there for almost 40 minutes doing nothing except replaying the conversation in microscopic detail. Every pause, every look, every word choice. The brain becomes dangerous when trapped inside uncertainty long enough. It starts manufacturing patterns to protect itself from chaos, or perhaps to create chaos explainable enough to survive. I couldn't tell which process had begun inside me. I only knew I couldn't stop analyzing. There are moments where paranoia still feels theoretical, abstract. Then there are moments where it becomes physical, visceral. The body joins the fear. That happened when I noticed the folder on my desk. Thin gray fold, unmarked. I was certain it hadn't been there earlier. Certain. but certainty had begun feeling unstable lately. I stared at it for several seconds before touching it. The paper felt cold. Inside were printed meeting transcripts, internal discussions, approval chains, decision summaries. At first glance, ordinary. Then I noticed something. Every major decision, mine, not credited explicitly, but positioned around my recommendation, my language, my phrasing, my logic, invisible fingerprints everywhere. And yet nowhere in the documents was I identified as responsible, no attribution, no ownership. Like my influence existed without my existence. My pulse quickened. I turned pages faster, the room shrinking around me. Every transcript felt wrong in the same way dreams feel wrong. Familiar structure, corrupted details. Then I found a line highlighted in yellow, no context. Just one sentence. The final determination was reached through consensus. I stared at the word until the letters began feeling visually strained. Consensus. Meaning nobody. Meaning everybody. Meaning responsibility dissolved into a crowd until no single person could drown. My stomach turned, because I understood suddenly. Not completely, but enough. Every decision had been mine, but only structurally, operationally, psychologically, never officially, never verbally, never in ways that attached consequence directly to me, unless necessary, unless convenient. The realization entered slowly and horribly, like icy water filling lungs. I had become a mechanism, a pressure valve, a ghost authority everyone obeyed while preserving distance from. And maybe that arrangement had existed far longer than I realized. I looked up sharply at the office windows, dark reflections, empty hallways beyond. For one impossible second, I thought I saw someone standing outside the glass wall of my office, watching. But when I blinked, nothing. Just reflection. I closed the folder carefully. Too carefully. Like it might explode if moved too suddenly. Then I noticed something handwritten on the back page. Small. Almost hidden. Blue ink. One sentence. He responds when acknowledged. My throat closed. I read it again. And again. The handwriting wasn't familiar. Or maybe it was. That frightened me more. I became aware of the blood pounding in my ears. The office now completely silent around me. Had everyone left? When had the floor become empty? I stood too quickly again. My chair struck the desk edge. The sound cracked through the silence like a gunshot. I turned toward the hallway. Empty. Lights still on. Rows of vacant desks stretching outward under fluorescent glare. The silence felt deliberate now. Constructed. I grabbed the folder and walked out of the office. Fast at first, then slower when I realized my pace looked frantic. Don't look unstable. The thought arrived automatically, instantly, as though someone else had placed it there. I slowed my breathing, forced composure. Elevator. Night elevator. The hallway carpet muffled my footsteps almost completely. That bothered me. I wanted noise, proof of physical existence. The elevator button glowed pale white beneath my thumb. I waited. The building hummed quietly around me. Air system. Electrical current. Somewhere far away a printer word briefly then stopped. The elevator doors opened. Empty. Of course empty. I stepped inside. The mirrored walls reflected me from 3 angles simultaneously. I looked exhausted, not tired, worn down, like someone being gradually erased by tiny daily abrasion. The doors closed. As the elevator descended, I looked at the folder again. He responds when acknowledged, not you respond, he responds. Clinical, observational, about me, or about someone else. The elevator jerked softly between floors. I suddenly realized something horrifying. I couldn't remember who had given me my last promotion. Not clearly. I remembered congratulations, meetings, new responsibilities, but not the actual conversation, not the face across from me. Memory gap, tiny ones, hairline fractures spreading backward through time. My breathing became shallow. The elevator suddenly felt too enclosed, too bright. When the doors opened into the lobby, I walked out immediately. Cold air hit me as the revolving doors turned. rain still falling outside, thin and relentless. The city smelled wet and metallic. Traffic hissed across slick pavement. People moved beneath umbrellas without looking at one another. I stood under the building awning, clutching the folder against my side, trying to feel normal, trying to reconnect to reality through observation. Red tail light, steam rising from street vents, a woman laughing into her phone while crossing the intersection. Normal world, real world. Then my phone vibrated. Unknown number. I stared at it. Something inside me already knew I shouldn't answer. I answered anyway. Silent, not empty silence. Breathing, very faint. Then a voice. Male, come. You've started noticing. Every muscle in my body locked. Who is this? No response. Only breathing again. Then, it's worse once you begin tracking it. The rain sounded suddenly louder. Traffic farther away. Like the city itself had stepped backward from me. What are you talking about? You know already. Click. Call ended. I stood frozen beneath the awning while people flowed around me. My phone screen reflected pale light across my face. I looked down at the call duration. 21 seconds. I tried calling back. Number unavailable, of course. I should have gone home. Instead, I started walking. No destination. Just movement. Rain dampening my jacket slowly. The city at night had always comforted me before. Its anonymity. Now anonymity felt threatening. Every passing face became suspicious. Every accidental glance loaded with implication. I became painfully aware of myself. My posture. My hand. The speed of my walk. Was I acting strange? Did people notice? The human mind under pressure becomes obsessed with external perception. I knew that, and knowing it didn't protect me from it. By the time I reached my apartment building, my thoughts had become tangled enough that silence felt dangerous. I turned on the television immediately after entering. Not to watch, to fill space. Voices flooded the apartment. Artificial laughter. Commercial music. Human noise. I dropped the folder onto the kitchen counter and stared at it from across the room. Part of me wanted to burn it. Another part wanted to dissect every page until morning. Instead, I poured whiskey into a glass with slightly trembling hand. The ice cracked sharply. I drank too fast. The alcohol hit my empty stomach immediately. Warmth spreading outward. Temporary false stability. Then a knock at the door. 3 soft knocks. Not loud. Controlled. I froze with the glass halfway to my mouth. Another knock. My apartment suddenly felt impossibly small. I set the glass down carefully. Every sound amplified. The refrigerator hum. Television murmuring in the background. My own pulse. The third knock came slower. Patient. Who knocks like that? Not neighbors. Not friends. Friends use name. I approached the door quietly. Looked through the peephole. A woman stood outside. Mid-40s maybe. Dark coat wet from rain. Expression unreadable. I didn't recognize her, but she looked calm. Too calm. Like someone arriving for a scheduled appointment. Can I help you? I asked through the door. Silent. Then, I think you should let me in. My chest tightened instantly. Who are you? Another pause. Then she leaned slightly closer to the door and spoke softly enough that I nearly missed it. They've started isolating you. The hallway suddenly felt very far away from the rest of the world. I didn't unlock the door. Didn't move. Neither did she. For several long seconds we remained separated by wood and silence. Then she said, "You don't remember me, do you?" And somewhere deep inside my stomach, something began to fall. Nobody spoke after that. The silence changed texture. Before it had been procedural. Controlled. Now it felt watchful. Like the room itself had lined closer. I became aware of the faint electrical buzz inside the fluorescent lights overhead. Thin, sharp, persistent. I couldn't stop hearing it. It threaded itself through every breath in the room. Every movement of fabric. Every microscopic shift of posture. The sound became unbearable precisely because nobody else acknowledged. I looked around the conference table again. Daniel's pen had stopped moving. Rebecca's coffee sat untouched, a thin gray film cooling across the surface now. The attorney's hands rested lightly on the folder in front of him, fingers interlocked too neatly. And Marion watched me with the calm expression people use around injured animals they aren't certain are still dangerous. That realization moved through me slowly. Not anger, not humiliation, something stranger. A hollowing sensation, like my organs had become weightless inside my body. I looked down at the unsigned paper again. The signature line waited patiently at the bottom of the page. Simple black ink. One line. One name. My name. The same name nobody had spoken for weeks. The same name that suddenly felt detached from me. Elias Vale. I stared at it too long. Long enough for the letters to lose familiarity. That happened sometimes when I was exhausted. Words stopped meaning things after enough repetition. They became shape, sounds, empty containers. Elias, Vale, nothing inside them. My throat tightened. Marion spoke carefully. We're not trying to punish you. That sentence entered the room softly. Too softly. Like something rehearsed many times beforehand. I looked at her. You prepared this, not a question. Nobody answered immediately. That was answer enough. Of course they prepared it. Meetings like this were never spontaneous. People did not accidentally gather legal representation, behavioral language, procedural ambiguity, and carefully controlled tones in a single room. No. This had structure, duration, planning, and suddenly a terrible thought surfaced. How many meetings had happened about me before this one? The realization made heat spread across the back of my neck. Conference rooms, closed doors, muted voice. My behavior discussed clinically while I worked 3 floors above them, believing I still understood the building around me. I imagined them lowering their voices when I passed, not because they feared discovery, because they feared escalation. The thought made my stomach tighten violently. I leaned back slowly in the chair. The leather creaked beneath me. Too loud. Everything sounded too loud now. My breathing, my heartbeat, the shifting air vents overhead. I rubbed my palms against my pants beneath the table. Sweat, cold sweat. My body knew something before my mind accepted it. Something fundamental had already shifted. Not today. Earlier. Much earlier. Today was simply the first moment I was allowed to see it. The attorney finally spoke again. We became concerned after the logistics restructuring. Logistic. Caleb Merce. The name struck me immediately. Too quickly. Rebecca noticed. I saw it happen in her eyes, a flicker. Recognition. Fear. My pulse accelerated. What happened to Caleb? No one answered. That silence was different from the others. This silence had consequence inside it. I felt my chest constrict. What happened? Marion exhaled carefully through her nose. He attempted suicide last month. The room disappeared. Not literally. Psychologically. Everything flattened. Sound dulled. The fluorescent buzzing stretched far away. I stared at her without fully understanding the sentence. Attempted. Past tense. Last month. Last month. Last month. The words repeated mechanically inside my head, while meaning arrived much slower. I remembered the file. The risk assessment. The recommendation for follow-up intervention. I remembered seeing it. I remembered ignoring it. Not maliciously. Efficiently. That distinction suddenly felt monstrous. My mouth opened slightly. No sound came out. Rebecca looked down at the table immediately. Daniel closed his eyes for 1 second too long. The attorney spoke quietly. He survived. The relief should have mattered more than it did. But another realization was already unfolding beneath. They believed I was connected to it. Not legally. Psychologically. Institutionally. My stomach twisted harder. I didn't know, I whispered. Nobody contradicted me. But nobody reassured me either. Because ignorance wasn't innocence anymore. Not after enough authority. That was the hidden cost of influence. Eventually your absences became decisions too. The room felt colder. Or maybe my body temperature had changed. I pressed my fingers against the edge of the table just to feel something solid. Smooth black wood. Cool surface. Real. At least I thought it was real. A strange dizziness moved through me. I suddenly remembered another moment. 3 weeks earlier. Late evening. Rebecca standing in my doorway. She had looked exhausted. Not physically. emotionally exhausted, like someone carrying invisible weight too long. You can't keep making people absorb your pressure, she'd said quietly. At the time, I interpreted it as criticism of workflow, efficiency, deadlines. Now the memory rearranged itself entirely. She wasn't talking about work. She was talking about me. I closed my eyes briefly. Behind my eyelids, images began surfacing rapidly. Employees watching my reactions before speaking. Managers apologizing excessively. Late-night messages sent with panicked urgency because I was still awake. People staying online because I stayed online. Not loyal. Atmosphere. I had become atmosphere. The realization hollowed me out completely. When I opened my eyes again, Marion was still watching me. Not coldly. That was the unbearable part. There was no triumph in her expression. Only fatigue, concern, and something resembling grief. I suddenly understood that this room had probably taken months to happen. Months of discussions, delays, attempts, conversations about risk, about intervention, about timing, about how unstable they believed I had become. A sharp pulse of humiliation surged through me. You think I'm dangerous, no one answered immediately. Again, always the silence first. Marion finally said, "We think you stopped understanding your effect on people." The sentence landed harder than accusation would have, because somewhere underneath my panic, underneath the defensive instinct clawing through my chest, another part of me recognized the truth inside. Not complete truth, but enough truth to destabilize everything. My breathing became uneven. I tried slowing it. Couldn't. The room seemed too bright suddenly. The fluorescent lights reflected harshly across the polished table, across my hands. My hands looked unfamiliar, paler than usual. Slight tremor in the fingertip. I curled them inward immediately. Hide the shaking. The instant I thought that, another realization followed. I was managing their perception of my stability, which meant I already believed the premise of the meeting. Cold wave moved through me. The attorney leaned forward slightly. Elias again. My name. Each time someone used it now, it felt strangely intimate, almost invasive, like hearing a forgotten language. We're recommending temporary leave and psychological evaluation. There it was. Finally. Direct enough to expose the structure underneath everything else. Not punishment, containment, observation, assessment. My chest tightened so violently it bordered on pain. I looked around the room again. Nobody looked surprised anymore, which meant they all already knew this was coming. Everyone except me. Always everyone except me. I laughed once. A short, fractured sound. Not amusement. Disbelief. You planned psychiatric intervention. Rebecca flinched at the word psychiatric. Marion didn't. We planned support. No, I said quietly. You planned management. The silence afterward confirmed it. Not because they agreed completely. Because the distinction itself no longer mattered. Support and management became indistinguishable once someone stopped trusting their own perception. And suddenly that was the true horror of the room. Not that they thought I was unstable. That I no longer knew whether they were wrong. The building hummed around us. Ventilation systems, distant phones, muted footsteps beyond the conference room walls. Normal office sounds continuing while my identity quietly disassembled itself at a conference table. I thought about Caleb again. A man reduced to a line item in a restructuring project. A risk assessment ignored because urgency consumed everything around it. And suddenly I saw the entire company differently. People walking around carrying invisible catastrophes inside themselves, while systems translated suffering into metrics. And me, I had become exceptionally good at that translation. Too good. The nausea returned. Heavy. Rolling. I stood again slowly. Nobody moved this time. No defensive postures. No raised hand. That somehow hurt worse, because they had stopped bracing against aggression. Now they were waiting for collapse. I walked toward the black glass wall beside the conference room. My reflection moved with me. Tall, pale, eyes sunken from sleeplessness. For one terrible second, I saw my father in the reflection instead of myself. Not visually. Behaviorally, the stillness, the pressure. The silence mistaken for control. My mother's voice echoed from childhood memory. He scares me when he gets quiet like that. I pressed my fingertips lightly against the glass. Cold, smooth, real. I hope. Behind me, Marion spoke softly. You need rest, rest. Such a harmless word. But exhaustion had become my identity so gradually, I no longer knew what existed underneath. Who was I without pressure? Without crisis? Without being knighted? The question terrified me because I had no answer. I turned back toward the room slowly. Everyone looked exhausted now. Not only me. All of them. Human beings trapped inside an environment where emotional damage had become operational routine. And for the first time in years, I suddenly understood something devastating. Nobody here was in control. Not me. Not Marion. Not legal. The system itself moved through people like weather, rewarding certain behaviors, destroying others, turning human beings into functions until eventually they forgot they were human at all. I looked down at the unsigned papers one last time. Then I pushed them gently back across the table. Not refusal. Not acceptance. I simply couldn't touch them anymore. Marion watched the movement carefully. What happens now? I asked. The question sounded smaller than I intended. Not authoritative. Not strategic. Just tired. Nobody answered immediately because nobody actually knew. That was the final fracture. Not discovering they feared me. Discovering they were improvising too. The attorney finally spoke. We proceed carefully, carefully. Always carefully. As if careful language could soften what people become to each other inside systems built entirely from pressure. My phone vibrated again. The sound cut through the room like a blade. Every eye dropped toward it. I stared at the screen. Unknown number. Another message. I opened it before I could stop myself. You still think this was your decision? That was all, no signature, no context. Just that sentence. Terrible coldness spread slowly through my body. Because the message was true. Or partly true. Or true in ways I didn't fully understand yet. I looked around the conference room one final time. The untouched coffee. The fluorescent light. The careful faces. The legal documents, the exhaustion. And suddenly the title of my life inside this company became horrifyingly clear. My name was never mentioned. But every decision was mine. Not officially. Not structurally. Psychologically. Through pressure. Through silence. Through emotional gravity. And maybe the most terrifying part was this. I had believed that made me powerful. Now I understood what it actually made me. Replaceable. I walked out of the conference room without another word. Nobody followed. The hallway outside stretched long and sterile beneath white office lighting. Employees moved in distant clusters, speaking quietly, carefully. The entire building suddenly felt alive in a way it never had before. Breathing. Watching. Absorbing. I passed my office slowly. The door remained half open. Dark inside. My monitors still glowed faintly across the room. Spreadsheet. Forecast. Budget. Systems waiting for input. Waiting for another decision. I stood there without entering. Because for the first time, the room no longer looked like authority. It looked like evidence. And somewhere deep beneath the exhaustion and fear and unraveling confusion, another emotion finally emerged. Grief. Not for the company. Not even for myself exactly. For the version of me that disappeared so gradually, I never noticed him leaving. I stared into the dark office while the building hummed endlessly around me. And slowly, quietly, I began to understand that losing control does not happen in the moment everything collapses. It happens long before. In all the tiny moments where people stop speaking honestly around you. In all the silences you mistake for respect. In all the pressure you normalize because it produces result. Until eventually you wake up inside a life where your name still exists, but the person attached to it is already gone.